Good morning, everybody on the West Coast. I'll get started again, and good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, elsewhere. I'll just give it another few seconds for people to join. Okay. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. The recordings are done for the convenience of stakeholders. They will be posted on the California ISO's website. Please do not quote those directly without the permission of the California ISO. And with that, I will get started. It is my pleasure to be here today presenting the Q1 and Q2 reports on market issues and performance. The links to both of those reports are listed on the title slide on your screen. These slides will also be posted. I've also included a link to the Department of Market Monitoring's website, where you can find our comments as well as a lot of our special reports for additional information. As I move through quite a bit of material today, please do stop me and ask questions. You can ask a question by putting a comment in the chat or by pressing #2 if you called in and not joined through the WebEx. And with that, I do need to say I have the pleasure of presenting the work of a really smart and dedicated set of staff. If I make a mistake in discussing anything that is my mistake, and the credit for the high quality analysis and graphics that you see here entirely goes to the department. And with that, I will get going. A couple highlights from the first half of 2022. Sorry about that. We had higher prices in the ISO and WEIM compared to 2021. Overall and across the entire footprint, that is driven by higher natural gas prices. WEIM membership has increased. We had 4 new members joining the WEIM. Bringing with them additional transfer capacity as well as additional participating resources. There are some special issues that I'd like to highlight, and I hope we have time to discuss today. One is an increase in congestion, historically high real-time imbalance offset costs in the CAISO, higher losses in the congestion revenue rights auction process, and higher revenues to virtual bidders. This chart shows monthly average California ISO prices. These have generally increased with gas prices. The blue line shows the day-ahead price. The yellow line shows the 15-minute price, and the green line shows the 5-minute price. Highlight a couple things here. One is that our California ISO's day-ahead price has moved fairly close to the 15-minute price. Virtual bidding allows for financial arbitrage to create incentives for those two prices to be close to really reduce that gap, as those are settled on the difference between the day-ahead price and the 15-minute price. We have seen consistently lower 5-minute prices, as shown in green, across the months. When we look at the explanation for this, across the footprint, the primary explanation has been the increase in gas prices, which you can see here. These again are showing monthly averages going back to 2019. As you can see, in 2021 we had a spike that was actually over the President's Day weekend. When you compare monthly averages for Q1 between 2021 and 2022, you see in some cases the 2021 is higher. That does have to do with that very short price spike period in the natural gas market, which did move the February price. Q2 to Q2, what we see at Henry Hub, which is our national index, PG&E Citygate, SoCal Citygate, Northwest Sumas as a representative hub in the Northwest, and El Paso Permian as a representative hub in the Southwest, is about a $4 increase per MMBTU across the board. This chart shows the correlation. This is actually a slide I included in the annual report, but it just shows very tightly the correlation between the SoCal Citygate hub price shown in the black dashed line and the average California ISO prices. Looking at the end of 2022, sort of the end of the period we're discussing today, April, May, and June, Q2, you can see that the market prices are falling slightly below what a 10,000 heat rate unit would be priced. Are there any questions on any of that? We had 2 new members joining the WEIM in 2020, 5 new members in 2021, and 4 new members joining in 2022. Avista Utilities, Bonneville Power Administration, Tacoma Power, and Tucson Electric Power. The pricing pattern, and I have some nice metrics for this, shows that the northwestern prices in the northwestern areas are regularly lower than the rest of the system, and this tends to be due to limited transfer capability, both into the combined northwestern regions as well as from those regions out. Peak California area prices exceed other areas due to both the impact of the EIM GHG and congestion. This table is a heat map. One way to look at the different prices that we see in the WEIM areas. This is showing average hourly prices for Q2 of 2022. The line at the across the top shows the system marginal energy cost, and the averages are shown for the major California ISO DLAPs as well as all of the other areas participating in the WEIM. Yellow shows areas where there is a higher difference, and the more yellow, the more orange or yellow, the higher the difference, and blue shows lower. So looking at the early part of the day, what we see are lower than the rest of the system prices in that northwestern region, which we also see again at the end of the day. We tend to see less price separation between the regions in the middle of the day when that solar generation is at its peak. This is a chart we've been producing for a long time, and I actually think in some ways this was a nice part of presenting the Q1 and Q2 together. It's interesting to compare the two side by side. One of the things that you'll see, the red dashed lines are showing average net load, which is shown on the right-hand axis. The slide on the left is Q1 the graph on the right is Q2. If you look at the difference, what you can see is that the net load in the second quarter was very, very low, averaging just over about 5 gigawatts in the middle of the day. So substantially lower than it had been in Q1. That's a seasonal trend that we've seen developing over the years with the increase we have in run-of-river hydro combined with the continued growth of both solar and wind resources within the California ISO footprint. I will come back to this, but as a reminder, there is I think the ISO hit its peak of renewable generation as a percent of load in the Q2 period. The Department of Market Monitoring did some analysis of that interval and what happened in that interval, and we put that into a board memo. If you're interested, I'd be happy to send you a link that is posted on our website. Part of what happened in that interval is that the ISO was able to export quite a bit of that generation. Doing so helps to decrease renewable downward dispatch. A couple other patterns I want to highlight on this chart. One, again, looking at the difference between the day ahead shown in blue and the 15-minute. You can see that those on an average hourly basis are moving fairly closely together. In the Q1, a little less in the Q2. So in the early morning hours of the Q2, I'll highlight here we have day-ahead prices that are higher across the middle of the day, the peak solar hours, and then day-ahead prices that are lower than the average 15-minute market at the peak of the day. So looking at the quarterly average, the two were fairly close, but once we look at the average hourly, they do separate depending on the time of day there. The 5-minute market prices are lower, especially in these peak periods. And I have a slide coming up that will explain why. Taking first a look at the convergence bidding, virtual profits increased to $41 million in Q2 alone, which is up from $38 million for the entire year of 2021. So that's a really significant increase. The figure at the top is showing the monthly revenues. We have virtual supply net revenues shown in green. We have virtual demand shown in blue. Virtual supply, and then we have in red are the total bid cost recovery charges, which are taken off of the virtual bidding revenue. Virtual supply has been profitable in the California ISO footprint for quite some time. Virtual demand in some months as well. Overall, the virtual demand revenues before the virtual bid cost recovery were about $9 million, compared to about $36 million for virtual supply. So here you can see where on a system, California ISO system-wide basis, that the hourly price differences really do create an opportunity for financial arbitrage there. Taking a look at one of the primary drivers for the difference between the 5-minute price and the 15-minute price One of the things that we've been noting in reports for quite some time is a difference in load adjustment, sometimes called imbalance conformance, by California ISO operators. There's a lot of interest in these imbalance conformance load adjustments. I'm highlighting the one set of metrics here, which happen to be for the Q2. I will say, if you are interested in these, we do publish monthly metrics as part of the WEIM RSE reporting that we do. We do publish those for across any area that does any significant amount of imbalance conformance. The California ISO does stand out from the other participating areas in the EIM, both in terms of the scale, the magnitude of the imbalance conformance that we see, as well as even when that takes into account the size of the balancing area as a whole, even as a percent. I see there's a question. I will finish talking about this slide and then take the question. The chart on the left shows average hourly imbalance conformance. Red is showing hour ahead, green is showing 15-minute, and the blue is showing the 5-minute. The dotted lines are for the Q2 of 2021, so comparing year on year, quarter to quarter. Here what you see is a marked increase in imbalance conformance in both the early morning peak as well as in the net load peak at the end of the day. The chart on the right is a box whisker. What that's showing in the box is the standard deviation up and down from the average, and then the whiskers are showing the extremes. For the 15-minute imbalance conformance, the purpose of including this kind of a metric is really to show that this is a regular increase in imbalance conformance. This isn't the result of a single sort of few days with a very, very high imbalance conformance, but this is a regular pattern. You see there's actually quite a bit of variation in some hours, but the net load hours at the peak there are fairly tight distribution. I'll pause and take a question.
Okay, we do have someone in the queue. Call your lines unmuted. Go ahead.
Good morning, Amelia. This is really a wonderful presentation, and I love the way you're moving through the slides. I had this is Alvis Svoboda from PG&E, and I just had a question about the two. You had two slides to do in a sense with convergence bidding, or they could be implicated in convergence bidding. One was that the day ahead and 15-minute prices were converging, and I assume your point there was that they're converging relative to previous years, let's say. At the same time, the revenues from convergence bidding have increased. Does this imply that the arbitrages were more locational that convergence bidding took advantage of, that would allow it to actually increase revenues during a period when there was improved convergence overall?
Yeah, thanks, Alva, for the question. What I was trying to highlight here is that there's an hourly time difference between the 15-minute price and the day-ahead price that is very correlated with the increase in convergence bidding revenue that we saw particularly in the Q2 this year. So that, yeah.
So basically, it was seeing that arbitrage that allowed those revenues to be realized. Thank you very much.
There was also an increase in congestion, and with that, we also saw, so both of the things are happening at the same time, where the increase in congestion is creating an opportunity for that kind of arbitrage as well, where paired bids, and historically we've seen about 50% of the convergence bids seem to be related to making that kind of a financial arbitrage across congestion differences that either materialize or fade in between the day ahead and the real time congestion differences.
Thank you. It's very interesting and very surprising. Appreciate you presenting this information.
You are very welcome. One of the other things we saw, and this again is comparing Q2 is the more interesting quarter actually, so I'll spend most of this talking about Q2 rather than Q1. But comparing Q2 of this year 2022 to Q2 of 2021, overall we saw a renewable increase of about 890 megawatts on average, so that's about an 8% increase. Increase in both hydro, even though it was and is still a very dry conditions across California and the West, as well as an increase in solar and in wind. The solar hydro increased by about 480 megawatts, solar by 210, and wind by 240. One of the measures we look at for hydro, the sort of hydro potential in some ways is the snowpack on April 1st. Snowpack on April 1st of 2022 was 35% of normal compared to about 62% of normal last year. Overall, very dry year. We are seeing more of the hydro generation earlier in the year as well as that snowpack is melting. I mentioned this earlier, and I think it's it's one of the metrics that one of the connections I'd like to make in the presentation is that the renewable, what is sometimes called renewable curtailment, but which we call reduction, increased in 2022. You can see it peaking there for the California ISO in April. These economic downward dispatches, which is what they are, would have been higher absent the opportunity to export, and that is really what has allowed some of that renewable generation to increase, is the ability to export that energy when the load within the California ISO is not able to absorb it. Again, the vast majority of these downward dispatches are economic downward dispatches, so responsive to economic bids. Taking a look at imports, so to actually show you how that was happening. The solid lines are showing day ahead in blue and 15-minute in yellow. Above the axis are imports. Below the axis are exports. The dotted line shows the net interchange before WEIM, and this solid line shows net interchange after WEIM. Each panel of this figure is comparing the same quarter to the quarter before. So the first is comparing 2020 to 2021, and the final is comparing 2021 Q2 to 2022 Q2. Concentrating here on the final, the two quarters of the most interest today. In both cases, it's interesting. What you see is an increase in imports between sort of comparing year on year, as well as an increase in exports. There is less change in the net interchange before WEIM. you do see in the middle of the day, after EIM, an increase in the net interchange after WEIM, as and with the California ISO becoming a net exporter after WEIM on average in those midday hours. These charts are, it's one of my, this chart actually made the cover of our annual report. I'm very, very proud of it. These charts show system-wide WEIM transfers in midday hours on average. The left side is showing Q1, the right side is showing Q2. So these are midday hours. The outer ring shows available export capacity. The inner ring shows transfers out. Colored by, the transfers are shown as the areas, and those are colored by the source. So the way to read these charts, and I'll start with the Q1, is that CAISO makes a large amount of export transfer capacity available to the WEIM, and that was entirely, in these hours, entirely filled by, on average, by exports. Those red exports were then flowing out to other areas of the EIM, and I'll use Arizona here as an example. Flowing out to Arizona, then Arizona was then exporting from Arizona, so wheeling through Arizona, in some cases a little bit to PNM, and some as well going to Pacific or East. You can spend a long time with these charts, watching the power flows, but overall, in the big picture, what we are seeing are exports coming from the California ISO, going into some of the other California areas, as well as flowing into the Southwest. Some of that is wheeled then through to the mountain Northwest. Some of that is then wheeled through again to the Pacific Northwest. Very, very persistent and common pattern. Noted earlier, there are 18 participants in the WEIM. This doesn't include all of them. We excluded areas with relatively small amounts of transfer on average, as a way to really simplify the figures. So you'll notice that there are different participants in different hours of the day. I wanted to highlight here the Q2 report includes a really, I think, a great news section. We finally broke down and added an appendix. The appendix includes, for each participating WEIM balancing authority area, average pricing for the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market, as well as average transfers. And it shows sort of both the net transfer and then the ties over which those EIM transfers, WEIM transfers, are flowing. So again, this is a stereotypical transfer pattern in the WEIM during the midday hours when California ISO net load is at its lowest. Taking a look at the peak hours, so these are the net load peak hours later in the day, and what you see is really a reversal. So instead of seeing all the power flowing out of the California ISO, we're seeing power on average in these hours flowing into the California ISO, and then I'll use Q1 as an example here. And again, let's start with Arizona. So Arizona's exporting. They're also importing a little bit from PAC East, then exporting to CAISO. So in some ways, a reversal of the flow that we saw earlier. CAISO is importing from Arizona and a number of other areas, and then exporting a little bit to the balancing area of Northern California. Similarly, looking at the Q2, you see the same pattern, a little lower exports from Arizona. Arizona's also exporting here to SRP. California ISO is exporting a little bit more in these hours than they were in the Q1. Some, again, to balancing area, Northern California, and then some to PowerX and BC Hydro as well. The charts are split up by region. It allows you to see, and if you count the tick marks, you can see the sort of regional level, Pacific Northwest, Mountain Northwest, Desert Southwest, and the California areas. We continue to see that WEIM transfer constraint congestion has a greater impact on prices than internal constraint congestion in all areas outside of the CAISO. So generally, the highest levels of congestion are seen to this northwestern areas, as I mentioned on the first slide. With the entry of a number of new areas that are bringing with them as they enter some additional transfer capacity, we have seen lower levels of transfer congestion, really, and price separation between those areas and the rest of the system. The asterisks here are to indicate that those areas were not in for the entire period, and this is showing average rates congested from and congested into for the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. All right, about halfway through, and I think my pace is about right to cover everything. I saved the best, some of the most interesting stuff for the last. This chart shows 15-minute market prices on average in the Q2 by WEIM area, separated by LMP price component. So the blue is the system-wide energy price, so that in any interval is the same across all of the different areas. You'll notice a slight variation, really, where the areas were not in for the entire period. Yellow shows the impact of congestion within CAISO. That's a little bit of a simplification. It would also include congestion within an WEIM area that can exist and does exist in very low frequency of intervals. We include that there. Red is showing congestion on WEIM transfer limits. The black is showing the loss component of the LMP, and the green is showing the WEIM greenhouse gas component. So overall, and this is from a load aggregation point perspective, the average price paid in the quarter is shown as the sum of all of those different components, positive and negative, and the areas are ranked in order from high price to low. One note on this is that the greenhouse gas component of the LMP is returned to areas to ensure that any resources deemed delivered are made whole for their greenhouse gas compliance obligations. So that, as well as the red congestion on WEIM transfer limits, may seem that it's, in this perspective, it's shown raising or lowering price, but the congestion rent associated with that is returned to the entities that made that transfer capacity available to the market. Pricing patterns here, lower prices in the Northwest, higher prices in the California areas, which has been typical. There is a comment, I think, but I don't think it was a question. I can't read that fast. All right. The Arizona, this is Arizona Public Service, but as I mentioned, we include an appendix in the report that has these by area. So my suggestion is if you are calling in as the representative of one of these areas, that you please do go and look at your results. That is obviously going to be the most interesting for you. This is just showing a pretty similar pricing pattern actually to the California ISO, where you have lower price hours in the middle of the day and higher price hours at the net load peak. And we're breaking up the average price in those hours in the same way. When there is a greenhouse gas component, that component existing in the price is telling you that there is a net import into California, which is assessed that greenhouse gas price. This can look really different in different areas, and that's part of why I put these two in the slide deck today. This is showing Bonneville Power Administration on average, and again, only from the time that they entered in May 3rd. Two differences here. One, as a new entrant, there is transitional period pricing, so there tend to be, in the instance where there is a power balance constraint violation, the price is set by the highest cleared bid rather than at a penalty price. So you tend to see lower prices because any price spikes that do occur at a lower price. But I think what's really driving the difference in pattern here is the geographic location relative to the congestion that we saw in Q2. I'll highlight this on the next few slides down, but we did see a lot of congestion on intertie constraints into the ISO, specifically from the Northwest into California. One other note here, I'm checking the time. One other note here I think is worth mentioning is the loss component, shown here in black, is very high in the Bonneville BPA area. The ISO announced a change to the calculation of this part of the price. That calculation, the explanation for that change is made in a BPM. If you are interested, I would suggest that it's worth the time to review the change in the calculation. My understanding of the change that's happening is that it's changing the way that transfers are accounted for, which would explain why this is having a particularly big impact in an area like BPA. Note there. I have a set of slides coming up that deal with congestion. I find it useful, and we do this in monitoring, and I note there's a hand up, to really think about cases. We see the same patterns repeatedly. One is low California ISO demand, high renewable, tend to be midday hours. You see south to north congestion within the CAISO. California WEIM areas transferring as a whole to the WEIM system, and congestion if it occurs into the northwestern portion of the WEIM. We see another set of conditions with high CAISO demand, low renewable, peak hours, where we see north to south congestion within the CAISO. We see intertie congestion into the CAISO, particularly at the northern from the north to the south. We see WEIM system transferring into the CAISO and other California WEIM areas, and WEIM congestion when it occurs from the northwestern portion of the WEIM to the rest of the system. And I'll stop and take a question.
No, there was one question in the chat. I'll just read it because I think it came up quickly for you. Somebody said these are great slides with valuable insights. Will the presentation be available somewhere on CAISO website, or can we request a copy?
Yes, the presentation will be available once I fix the typo at the front, and it will be publicly posted. The recording will also be posted.
Put the link in the attendees chat box to our website.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking at day ahead, I'll keep going here because yeah.
We also have a question from Kathleen and Ryan and Dan. There's three up right now.
Okay.
This is Dan Williams
from,
Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just jumping in because I was unmuted. Going back, great presentation, of course, as always. Going back to any of slides like 17 through 19, just want to clarify a couple things here. So when I was reading these just out of the report, I was taking the red congestion on EIM transfer constraints as being the congestion that is accruing on the EIM BA side of the constraint versus the congestion within CAISO being the congestion accruing on the CAISO side of the constraint from the discussions that we've been having in EDAM and EIM about congestion revenue allocation. Am I reading that right or reading that wrong?
No, the yellow is for internal congestion, so it's for constraints within a BA. The red is for EIM transfer congestion. You are not incorrect that there's a difference between the way that CAISO transfers with CAISO, how the settlement of that congestion rent, sorry, that came out all boggled, is compared to the typical congestion rent allocation for 2BAs. Typically with 2BAs in the WEIM, the transfer rent on the transfer constraint is split between the 2BAs. I do think in most cases with CAISO that transfer rent accrues entirely to the non-CAISO BA.
Okay, I guess this is a little bit difficult.
This yellow here
go ahead.
Is showing the impact of, in this case particularly, these are transfer constraints within the CAISO boundary.
Okay, I may need to just wait and unpack that a little bit more in the next CAISO meeting where we're going over some of the revenue allocation. But it's interesting data. And then the other question that I had that I was reminded with the GHG component is that there used to be an EIM report that showed the resources supporting EIM transfers into the CAISO, like broken out by type. And I can't remember when that went away, but these slides had me thinking about it and going looking for it, and I couldn't find it and was wondering if you know what happened to that.
I am not, I don't know what happened to the CAISO report. I do know we publish the WEIM resource level sort of averages for the deemed delivered megawatts, so that's the 5-minute market in our annual report. So that would be available through the end of 2021. Okay.
Good, yeah, because there was some really interesting information in your report just on the kind of wheel-through totals, transfer totals between some of the further away BAs and the closer to CAISO BAs that may give some indication of secondary dispatch and some of those things. So I'll go looking for that in the annual report and maybe ask CAISO later about other places that's being picked up. But thank you.
Sure. One thing to keep in mind is that the 5-minute quantity of GHG tends to be lower than the 15-minute quantity of GHG transferred into the CAISO. And that does result in a difference in the nature of the GHG fuel mix that is deemed delivered.
Yeah, and that was another thing I wanted to ask about, but it's kind of short on time, is just kind of how DMM's looking at the impact of the change in CAISO load conformance between HASP, FMM, and then being fully pulled out in RTD, and what that is doing to the transfer totals. And I think that's tied up in what you're just saying about GHG too. But I'll let you keep going. Sorry.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll take another couple questions.
Hey, Amelia. Yeah, no, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just have a request for you and your department to consider. These are your data is really helpful. As I'm trying to analyze it and understand some of the metrics. So I looked at your Appendix A, and I know it doesn't, unless I'm missing it, I didn't see those metrics for the CAISO EIM CAA.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to compare apples to apples when I was looking through it. I wanted to share that with you, that it would be kind of helpful.
No, it's on our, thanks Kathleen, it's on our list for next year, not next year, for next quarter. And we are
awesome.
Looking to do, so for CAISO, what we would do rather than just do CAISO level metrics, which are obviously in the report, but kind of averaged across the DLAPs, we would, I think, do DLAP levels for CAISO because it's so much bigger. Yeah.
That would be helpful if you could keep the CAISO level just so we could process the apples to apples, but then dig into the DLAPs. That would just provide us the most value. I wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Unless there are other questions, I will move on because I really did pack the end of the presentation. I've got a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to speed up. Day ahead congestion rent is about $391 million, which is an increase over, and you can see that predominant sort of low load, high renewable pattern that we see with lower prices in the south, where there tends to be a concentration of those renewable resources and higher prices in the north. When we look at import congestion, we see, as typical, most of the congestion occurring on Malin and Knob, but that increasing substantially in the Q2. So keep that in mind as we move into, those are both day ahead. We move into CRRs. This is just a little bit of history, and I'll go quickly, but major changes in the ISO CRR auction process that occurred beginning in 2019. Since then, we've seen average losses around 45 million a year before, with average losses of 114 million per year. Once we look at Q2, we are now seeing in Q2 losses that are about $58 million in Q2, total for Q1 and Q2 of about $70 million. So a substantial increase in losses to ratepayers from congestion revenue rights that are auctioned with the CAISO. One of the reasons for that increase is the increase in congestion, but even when we look at that as a percentage of the congestion rent, we are seeing an increase. So in the Q2, that's about 21% of the day-ahead congestion rent, compared to about 10% for the Q1. Looking at the quarterly values, you'll notice if you go back, there was an increase in the Q3. What we're seeing in Q2 is different from Q3 of 2020. In Q3 of 2020, there were allocated rights that were resold in the auction, which can happen, is the right of any entity that holds those allocated CRRs, were sold at a loss. What we're seeing in the Q2 of 2022 are losses to transmission ratepayers from rights auctioned by the California ISO. DNM continues to recommend that the congestion revenue rights auction be replaced by an exchange of willing buyers and sellers. One of the very most important things, I think, in the Q2 report is a section doing a deep dive on the real-time imbalance offset costs. These increased to historic levels that we have never seen since 2009 for offset cost values. What offset costs are and it's essentially the difference in the real time between what is paid to generators and what is paid by load. The offset costs shown here are paid by California ISO measured demand. There is an offset calculation in the WEIM as well. That is not included here. In June alone, there were around $78 million of congestion offset costs. This was included in the discussion at the MPPS. If you are interested, I would suggest going back and listening to that recording when it's available. And I checked yesterday; it's still not up on the website, but really recommend that. Going into the what we did is do a deep dive into the settlements. This is showing for June only the 15-minute market congestion imbalance identified by constraint. So this is showing that about 30.5 was for the ML-RM2, so Malin-Round Mountain constraint, and then Tracy, and then about 6.9 million to the 6110 nomogram. We have a little bit more explanation in the report. Start with the top. That nomogram is a 15-minute market only constraint that is used to help the CAISO manage unscheduled flows. The ISO was also using a 5-minute market only constraint, and we have some metrics that I think capture the impact of that on price. It was one of the most impactful internal constraints on 5-minute market prices. We, however, are still working to gather the shift factor data we need to really break out the impact of that constraint specifically. So, always a challenge. When we look at what's really driving these to be settled as imbalances, what we see is that about 8 million, so this is just breaking down that 15-minute market imbalance of the congestion offset. About 8 million of that is for a constraint that has equal or greater or equal 15-minute market limit. About 16 million has a lower limit. And in the yellow, there is about more than half, that has a day-ahead limit that was not shown. That can happen either because there is no day-ahead limit, which is true for the Malin-Round Mountain. I think I maybe misspoke earlier and identified this 6110. Or it can be because the constraint was not saved in the critical constraint data for real time. I will move very quickly. Ancillary service costs lower than offsets at 93 million total. Flexible ramping capacity. It's the same story we've been telling for a very long time, almost always a zero price. Looking forward to the December implementation of the nodal pricing and just leave off with, we have a lot of coverage of the RSE, the WEIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation. Please do look at the monthly reports. We have noted in those reports some issues with the implementation of the changes to the tests that were implemented in June. We will be doing a presentation of this at the board meeting coming up in a week or so. So look forward to that. And with that, I will stop and take some questions. I can stick around a little bit after the call as well.
Ryan Millard has a comment. Ryan, if you'd like to express that. Michelle, can you unmute Ryan?
Sure, one moment. Ryan, if you press the hand icon so I can find your line, please.
Hi, Amelia. This is Ryan from Portland General. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I just wanted to, just real quick, echo my thanks to the DMM team for making this information available. I think we were a little surprised at the delayed release of the 2022 quarterly report. So I just wanted to stress how useful it is as a stakeholder to be able to review this information as soon as possible, because it really allows us an opportunity to leverage some of the metrics that you guys in your team have put together in our policy discussions with the ISO. So I just wanted to encourage DMM to start publishing its analysis closer to the end of the prior quarter rather than combining the multiple quarters at the tail end of the year. I don't want to compromise, obviously, the quality of the data that you're providing, but the timeliness of its availability is also really important too. So anything that you and your team can do to expedite that is greatly appreciated. But thanks so much for putting this together.
You are very, very welcome. I would highlight here, if you can, please do review the WEIM RSE reports. Those are available, they're monthly. They're typically published within a few weeks. That's because the data that we need to produce those reports is available. Part of what changed, not this year, but last year, is the availability of much of the data that we need to create these reports is now not available to us until almost a quarter after the end of the quarter. So in this case, we held the Q2 in waiting for the explanation for the offset costs that the ISO offered in the MPPF, but most of the time it is because of the lack of settlement data. We've, in some cases, gone to sort of reporting the settlement data portions, the quarter lagged. So the Q2 report has Q1 BCR numbers. We really haven't found the right timeliness to get on the right metric. One, and I'll repeat this again, I think the most timely reporting we're doing is on the WEIM. Those reports have most of the information I think you would be looking for to do the kind of analysis that you're doing in the WEIM. If there's something particularly you'd like to add to that so that would be available on a timely basis, please do reach out and let me know. We may be able to add it to that report.
Great. That's great context. Thanks for that.
Yeah, sure. All right. With that, if there are no other questions, I will stop sharing.
Amelia, one more question. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I was trying to find more information about your identifying that the state of charge for batteries may not have been implemented correctly, and I only see like a single sentence. Can you point me to more information on your analysis if it's available, and if not, yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, sorry, I have something stuck in my throat, but yeah. Yes, we can. There is in the latest WEIM report at the very end, I think a paragraph explaining the sources for some of those issues.
Okay, I'll look further. Thank you.
Also, Kathleen, it will be a subject of discussion at the board meeting, I'm sure. The presentation there. Yeah. That presentation should be published before the meeting. It includes some counterfactuals. Our DMM's counterfactuals are different than the ISO's, but both are looking at differences between the passage of the test by the CAISO with the correct implementation or the way it was implemented. All right. Okay, well, thank you all for your time and your patience. Apologies for the delay in publication. And I'll repeat what I said to Ryan, which is, please do let me know if there are things that you would find very useful in a timely manner. If we can, we will publish those more quickly. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining today's event, and thank you for using event services. Your event has ended, and you may disconnect.